He was forced to marry her for her fortune, but her heart was his ruin. The Duke of Pembroke had everything: title, lands, a name that commanded respect across England. But when the creditors came knocking, he had no choice but to marry the quiet heiress everyone overlooked. He thought he could take her fortune and keep his heart locked away. He thought wrong, because Isabella Fairchild wasn't just rich. She was the one woman who could see through his armor, and when scandal threatened to destroy them both, Charles would have to choose between the pride that defined him and the love that could ruin him. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The rain hammered against the windows of Pembroke Hall with such violence that Charles Edward Pembroke, 9th Duke of Pembroke, could barely hear his solicitor's words over the storm. Not that he needed to hear them clearly. The numbers on the ledger before him told the story well enough. His father's gambling debts, his mother's extravagant spending, his own youthful foolishness, all of it had culminated in this moment, sitting in the study that had belonged to Pembrokes for 200 years, learning that he was about to lose everything. "Your Grace, if I may speak plainly," Mr. Whitmore said, adjusting his spectacles with trembling fingers. The old solicitor had served the Pembroke family for 30 years, and the grief in his eyes was genuine. "Without a significant infusion of capital within 3 months, the estate will be seized. The townhouse in London is already mortgaged beyond its value. The tenants can barely afford their rents after last year's failed harvest, and I cannot in good conscience press them further." Charles stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that had been drilled into him since boyhood. A duke does not slouch. A duke does not show weakness. A duke does not admit defeat. But what was a duke without land, without money, without the means to maintain his position? He was 28 years old, and he had never worked a day in his life because dukes did not work. They managed, they invested, they married well. "There are options, Your Grace," Whitmore continued hesitantly. "The Fairchild girl, for instance. Her father made his fortune in shipping and imports. Vulgar money, to be sure, but substantial. Very substantial. I understand she has a dowry of £150,000 and property in Yorkshire that generates considerable income." Charles turned from the window, his jaw tight. "The merchant's daughter? The one who sat in the corner at Lady Ashford's ball last season, saying nothing to anyone?" "The very same, Your Grace. Miss Isabella Fairchild. I am told she is modest in temperament and has had no other serious suitors. Her father is most eager to see her well settled, and what better settlement than a duke?" Whitmore's voice carried the faintest hint of distaste, as though the words themselves were coated in something unpleasant. "Mr. Fairchild's ambitions are transparent. He wishes to purchase respectability for his daughter, and you, forgive me, require what he has in abundance." The words hung in the air like the smoke from the dying fire. Charles felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. This was what his life had come to, bartering his name like a commodity, attaching it to a woman he neither knew nor cared for, all to save stones and mortar, and a title that suddenly felt more like a noose than a crown. He had always known he would marry for position, for alliance, for the continuation of his line, but he had imagined choosing the time and the woman himself. He had imagined someone from his own world, someone who understood the unspoken rules and expectations of their class. "Arrange a meeting with Mr. Fairchild," Charles said finally, each word tasting of ash. "Tell him the Duke of Pembroke is prepared to discuss terms." 2 weeks later, Charles found himself in the Fairchild residence in Bloomsbury, a neighborhood that was respectable but decidedly not fashionable. The house itself was well appointed, perhaps too well appointed, with new furnishings that gleamed with the sheen of recent purchase, and paintings that looked expensive but lacked the patina of family heritage. Everything about the place screamed of money, trying desperately to look like something more than money. Mr. Fairchild was a broad man with shrewd eyes and hands that still bore the calluses of his earlier years working the docks. He greeted Charles with enthusiasm that bordered on servility, bowing so deeply that Charles felt a flash of irritation. This was the man who held his future in those work-roughened hands, and the knowledge was bitter. "Your Grace, what an honor, what an extraordinary honor for our humble home," Fairchild said, gesturing toward the drawing-room where tea had been laid out with painful formality. "Please do sit. My daughter will join us momentarily." Isabella has been quite overcome with anticipation at this meeting. Charles doubted that very much. He took his seat and accepted the tea he did not want. studying the room with the casual arrogance that was second nature to him. A pianoforte stood in the corner, clearly expensive, clearly new. The curtains were French silk, the kind his own mother had once ordered before the money ran out. Every object in the room was a declaration. We have arrived, we matter, we belong. When Isabella entered, Charles barely glanced at her initially. She was exactly as he remembered from that ball, small and slight, with brown hair pulled back in a simple style, and a dress of pale green that did nothing to distinguish her. She curtsied with perfect correctness, her eyes downcast, and took the seat her father indicated without speaking. She might have been a piece of furniture for all the impression she made. "Miss Fairchild," Charles said, because courtesy required acknowledgement even in the most mercenary of transactions. "I trust you are well." "Quite well, Your Grace, thank you," she replied, her voice soft but steady. She looked up then, just for a moment, and Charles was startled by her eyes. They were grey, a clear, intelligent grey that seemed to see more than he was comfortable revealing. Then she looked down again at her hands folded in her lap, and the moment passed. The negotiation, if it could be called that, was swift and brutal in its efficiency. Mr. Fairchild wanted a duchess for a daughter and was willing to pay handsomely for the privilege. Charles wanted survival for his estate and his name. The dowry would be £150,000 paid upon marriage, plus an annual allowance of £5,000 for Isabella's personal use, plus the transfer of 2 profitable properties in Yorkshire to be held jointly. In return, Isabella would become the Duchess of Pembroke, with all the rights and privileges attendant to that position, and any children of the marriage would carry the Pembroke name and title. "I believe, Your Grace, that we have the foundation of an excellent arrangement," Fairchild said, his face flushed with pleasure, subject, of course, to the young people finding themselves compatible. Charles nearly laughed at the absurdity. Compatible, as though compatibility mattered in transactions such as these, as though this were a matter of hearts and affection rather than pounds and property. But he smiled thinly and nodded. "Of course. Perhaps Miss Fairchild and I might take a turn in the garden? I believe the rain has cleared." The garden was small but well tended, with gravel paths and rose bushes that were just beginning to bud. Isabella walked beside him in silence, her hands clasped before her, her eyes on the path. Charles searched for something to say and found nothing. What did one discuss with a woman one was about to marry purely for her money? The weather seemed insulting. Her interests were unknown. His own interests, hunting, riding, cards, seemed inappropriate for present company. "Your Grace," Isabella said suddenly, stopping near a stone bench, "may I speak plainly?" The request surprised him. "By all means." She turned to face him fully, and again he was struck by those grey eyes, calm and assessing. "I am aware of why you are marrying me. I am not foolish, nor am I romantic enough to imagine otherwise. My father has explained the situation quite clearly. You need money. He wants a title for me. It is a business arrangement, and I accept it as such." The bluntness of her words hit him like cold water. Charles found himself wrong-footed, uncertain how to respond. He had expected demure acceptance or perhaps shy questions about where they would live. He had not expected this clear-eyed acknowledgement of the transaction. "I see," he said carefully. "That is refreshingly honest of you, Miss Fairchild. I find honesty saves considerable time and confusion," she replied. "I have no illusions about love or romance, Your Grace. I do not expect you to care for me, nor will I burden you with expectations of affection. What I do expect is respect and courtesy, which I will return in equal measure. I will manage your household well. I will conduct myself in a manner befitting my position, and I will not shame your name. In return, I ask only that you treat me with the basic dignity owed to any human being, regardless of the commercial nature of our union." Charles stared at her. In all his imaginings of this conversation, this had not been among them. She was offering him exactly what he thought he wanted, a marriage without messy emotions, without demands for things he could not give, without the pretense of feelings neither of them possessed. It should have been perfect. It should have been a relief. Instead, he felt something uncomfortably like shame. "You have my word, Miss Fairchild," he said after a long moment. "I will treat you with respect." She nodded, a small, satisfied motion. "Then I believe we understand each other, Your Grace. We may inform my father that we are compatible." The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the chapel at Pembroke Hall, A small affair despite Mr. Fairchild's obvious desire for something grander. Charles had insisted on simplicity, telling himself it was a matter of taste and propriety, when in truth he simply wanted the whole business concluded as quickly as possible. The less ceremony surrounding this transaction, the better. Isabella arrived the day before, accompanied by her father and 2 wagons filled with her possessions, and Charles assumed the first installment of the dowry that was even now being transferred to his accounts. He greeted her formally in the entrance hall, bowed over her hand, and assigned Mrs. Davison the housekeeper to show her to her rooms. She thanked him with the same calm courtesy she had shown in the garden and disappeared up the stairs without looking back. That night, Charles sat in his study with a glass of brandy, staring at the fire and trying to feel something other than this hollow resignation. Tomorrow he would speak vows to a woman he did not love, promising to honor and cherish when what he really meant was tolerate and maintain. Tomorrow his financial crisis would be resolved, his estates would be saved, his name would endure. Tomorrow he would sell the last thing he possessed that was truly his own, his freedom to choose. The ceremony itself was mercifully brief. Isabella wore a dress of ivory silk that probably cost more than his tenants earned in a year, her hair arranged with pearl pins that caught the light from the chapel windows. She spoke her vows in that same steady voice, without tremor or hesitation, and when Charles slipped the ring onto her finger, he felt the coldness of her hand and wondered if she felt anything at all. The wedding breakfast was equally subdued. Mr. Fairchild made a speech about the union of commerce and nobility, about the strength of English enterprise, about the bright future ahead. Charles smiled tightly and thanked him with words that meant nothing. Isabella sat beside him, eating small bites of food, answering when spoken to but volunteering nothing. She was the perfect aristocratic bride, decorative, silent, and ultimately invisible. That night, Charles performed his marital duty with the same detached efficiency he brought to all unpleasant necessities. Isabella submitted without complaint, but also without participation, lying still and quiet in the darkness of her bedchamber, as he did what was required, and then left. He returned to his own rooms feeling something worse than guilt, a kind of disgust with himself that he could not quite name or shake. In the weeks that followed, a pattern established itself. Isabella ran the household with surprising competence, conferring with Mrs. Davison about menus and repairs, reviewing the accounts with careful attention, even venturing into the village to introduce herself to the tenants and the vicar's wife. She was courteous to everyone, from the lowest scullery maid to the butler, learning names and preferences with what seemed like genuine interest. Charles watched from a distance, surprised by her efficiency and slightly resentful of how easily she slipped into the role of duchess. He kept to his study most days, reviewing estate business that was newly solvent thanks to her money, riding out to inspect fields and fences that could now be properly maintained, slowly rebuilding what had crumbled under his father's neglect. He dined with Isabella each evening because propriety required it, enduring long silences, broken only by the clink of silverware or brief exchanges about household matters. She never asked about his day, never shared opinions about anything beyond the domestic, never gave him any opening to know her beyond the efficient, colorless surface she presented. It was exactly what she had promised, exactly what he had thought he wanted, and it chafed at him in ways he could not explain. One evening, about 2 months into their marriage, Charles entered the drawing room to find Isabella at the pianoforte. He had not known she played, but her fingers moved over the keys with confidence, drawing out a melody he recognized as Beethoven, complex and melancholy. He stood in the doorway, arrested by the unexpected sight. This was the first time he had seen her do anything that was not directly related to household management or duty. She must have sensed his presence because she stopped abruptly, her hands falling to her lap. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not mean to disturb you." "You are not disturbing me," Charles said, stepping into the room. "I did not know you were musical." "You never asked," she replied, and though her tone was not accusatory, the words landed with unexpected weight. He found himself without response. She was right, of course. In 2 months of marriage, he had never asked her anything about herself beyond what was necessary for the smooth running of the household. He had treated her exactly as he had promised, with respect and courtesy and absolutely nothing more. "Play something else," he said, surprising himself. She hesitated, her eyes searching his face as though trying to divine his meaning. Then she turned back to the instrument and began again, this time something lighter, a Mozart sonata that filled the room with bright, dancing notes. Charles sat in the chair near the fire and listened, watching her profile as she played. There was something different about her now, a looseness in her shoulders, a slight smile on her lips. This was not the dutiful Duchess. This was someone else entirely, someone he had never glimpsed. When she finished, he applauded softly. "You play very well." "Thank you, Your Grace. My mother insisted on lessons. She died when I was 12, but the music, it helps me remember her." It was the first personal thing she had ever told him, the first crack in the facade of perfect, emotionless competence. Charles found himself curious, wanting to know more, but uncertain how to ask without seeming to violate the unspoken terms of their arrangement. "I am sorry for your loss," he said finally, inadequately. "It was a long time ago," Isabella replied, rising from the pianoforte. "If you will excuse me, Your Grace, I believe I will retire." And just like that, the moment was gone. She curtsied and left, and Charles was alone again with the fire and his thoughts and the echo of music lingering in the air. The seasons turned. Autumn gave way to winter, and Pembroke Hall took on the quiet, close feeling of a house battened against the cold. Charles found himself noticing small things about Isabella, the way she always wore a shawl in the library because that room never seemed to warm properly, how she took her tea with milk but no sugar, how she had quietly arranged for the tenant's children to receive winter clothing without ever asking his permission or seeking praise for the gesture. She was there and not there, present in every aspect of his life, but somehow always maintaining that careful distance. He told himself he preferred it this way: a wife who made no demands, who expected nothing, who understood that theirs was an arrangement of convenience rather than affection. It was rational, it was civilized, it was exactly what he had agreed to. But sometimes, late at night, he found himself thinking about those grey eyes and wondering what thoughts moved behind them. Sometimes he paused outside the music room when he heard her playing, listening to melodies that seemed to carry emotions she never displayed elsewhere. Sometimes he caught himself wanting to ask her opinion on matters beyond menus and household accounts, wanting to know if she read the same books that lined the library shelves, if she had views on the political debates that filled the London papers, if she ever felt as lonely in this cold, formal house as he increasingly did. He never asked. He had promised her a marriage without messy emotions, and he was a man of his word. Winter deepened into the bleakest part of January. The roads became impassable, snow piling high against the walls of Pembroke Hall until the house felt like an island unto itself. Charles and Isabella were trapped together with the servants and the cold and the long, dark evenings that stretched endlessly before the fire. One night, a tremendous storm rolled across the countryside, wind howling like something alive and hungry. Charles was in his study going over correspondence when he heard a crash from somewhere in the house, followed by the sound of running feet. He emerged into the hallway to find Isabella in her nightdress and wrapper, her hair loose around her shoulders, holding a candle with a shaking hand. "The east wing," she said quickly when she saw him. "I think a tree has come through the window. Mrs. Davison is gathering linens to contain the damage." They ran together through the dark corridors, Charles grabbing additional candles from the hall table as they went. The scene in the east wing was chaos, wind shrieking through a shattered window, rain and snow driving in, a massive branch protruding through the glass like an accusing finger. Several servants were already there, struggling to cover the opening with whatever materials they could find. Charles immediately took charge, directing the footman to cut away the branch while he and the butler worked to nail boards over the window frame. Isabella moved among the servants with calm efficiency, helping to mop up water, salvaging what furniture could be saved, speaking encouragement to a young maid who was near tears at the destruction. It took hours to secure the room and ensure no other windows were in danger of failing. By the time they finished, Charles was soaked through and shivering despite his exertions. Isabella looked no better, her wrapper plastered to her frame, her hair dripping. But there was color in her cheeks and something bright and alive in her eyes that he had never seen before. "Thank you," she said as they walked back toward their rooms, servants trailing behind. "You responded quickly. The damage could have been much worse." "As did you," Charles replied. "You kept everyone calm. That maid, Jenny I think her name is, she was on the verge of panic until you spoke to her." Isabella smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face entirely. "Jenny is very young and far from her family. A kind word costs nothing." They reached the hallway where their rooms diverged. Charles should have bid her good night and disappeared into his chambers. Instead, he found himself saying, "You are very good with them, the servants. They respect you. They are people, Your Grace, deserving of respect regardless of their station. Surely you believe that as well?" There was something challenging in her voice, a spark of the personality she kept so carefully hidden. "I do," he said, surprised by how much he meant it. "My father did not. He believed service was owed by virtue of rank alone. It made him a poor master and, I suspect, a poor man." Isabella studied him for a long moment, her grey eyes searching his face. "You are not your father." The simple statement, delivered with such certainty, struck something deep in Charles's chest. How did she know? How could she possibly know the weight of that legacy, the fear that he would repeat his father's mistakes, that the cruelty and carelessness might be written in his very blood? "No," he said quietly. "I'm trying not to be." "I can see that," Isabella said. "Good night, Your Grace. You should get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." She disappeared into her room before he could respond, leaving him standing in the hallway with water pooling at his feet and a strange warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. After that night, something shifted between them. It was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone who did not live in the house, but Charles felt it like the change in pressure before a storm. Isabella still maintained her careful courtesy, still ran the household with quiet efficiency, still asked nothing of him beyond basic civility. But there were moments now, small cracks in the facade, when he glimpsed the person beneath. She had opinions, it turned out, quite strong ones. He discovered this one evening when he casually mentioned a proposal before Parliament to restrict working hours for children in factories. Isabella, who had been silent through most of dinner, suddenly looked up with eyes blazing. "About time," she said sharply. "Children of 7 and 8 working 14 hours a day in conditions that would break grown men, it is barbaric. Anyone with eyes can see it, and anyone with a conscience should oppose it." Charles blinked, startled by her vehemence. "You have strong feelings on the matter. Do you not?" she challenged. "Or does your position insulate you from caring about such things?" It was the first time she had directly questioned him, the first time she had shown anything like real emotion in his presence. Charles found himself leaning forward, engaged in a way he had not been at dinner in months. "I do care, actually. I have been considering how to address the matter with my fellow lords. Many will oppose any regulation as interference with commerce. Commerce built on the backs of children is not commerce. It is exploitation," Isabella said fiercely. "My father began in the factories, Your Grace. He was 9 years old when he started working the docks, 12 when he nearly lost his hand in a winch accident. He understands the cost of progress measured in broken bodies and lost childhoods, even if he has chosen to forget it in his pursuit of respectability." Quote, the bitterness in her voice surprised Charles. "You disapprove of your father." "I disapprove of anyone who forgets where they came from," Isabella said, then seemed to catch herself, the shutters coming down over her eyes again. "Forgive me. That was inappropriate." "No," Charles said quickly, not wanting the conversation to end. "It was honest. You promised me honesty, remember? I appreciate it." She looked at him with something like surprise, and for the rest of the meal they talked, truly talked, about politics and reform and the responsibilities of wealth and position. It was the most engaged Charles had been in a conversation in longer than he could remember, and when Isabella finally excused herself for the evening, he found himself reluctant to let her go. Over the following weeks, more cracks appeared. Charles discovered that Isabella read voraciously, working her way through his library with systematic thoroughness. She had opinions on everything from agricultural innovation to the conflict in Spain, and when he asked, she shared them with an intelligence and insight that consistently surprised him. She was not merely educated, she was genuinely knowledgeable, with a mind that grasped complex issues quickly and thoroughly. He began seeking her out, asking her views on estate matters, on investments, on political questions that vexed him. She responded thoughtfully, never claiming expertise she did not possess, but offering perspectives he had not considered. When he mentioned a problematic tenant who was falling behind on rent, she suggested investigating the condition of the man's cottage before taking action, noting that a leaking roof or a sick cow might explain the difficulty better than laziness or dishonesty. Charles followed her advice and discovered she was exactly right. The tenant's roof had partially collapsed in a winter storm. The cost of repairs was modest compared to the cost of eviction and finding a new tenant, and the man's gratitude was genuine and touching. "How did you know?" Charles asked Isabella later, genuinely curious. "I listened," she said simply. "When I visited the cottages, several of the tenant wives mentioned the damage from the storm. It seemed logical that it might be connected to the financial difficulty. People rarely fail to meet their obligations without reason, Your Grace. Usually the reason is circumstance rather than character." It was such a compassionate view, so different from the harsh judgments his father had always rendered, and Charles found himself wondering how he had ever thought this woman cold or colorless. She was neither. She was careful, measured, protecting something vulnerable beneath the facade of competence. And for reasons he could not quite explain, he found himself wanting to be worthy of her trust, wanting to prove that he was not the man who had married her for her money and nothing more. Spring arrived with a rush of green and birdsong, and with it came an invitation that filled Charles with dread. Lord and Lady Ashford were hosting their annual ball in London, the first major social event of the season, and attendance was essentially mandatory for anyone of rank. Charles had not been to London since his wedding, had been content to remain at Pembroke Hall dealing with estate matters and avoiding the whispers he knew awaited him. Everyone in society knew why he had married Isabella Fairchild. Everyone knew about the money. The speculation and gossip would be relentless. "We do not have to go if you would prefer not to," Charles said to Isabella over breakfast, watching her reaction carefully. "I know it will be difficult." Isabella set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Are you concerned for my comfort, Your Grace, or for your own embarrassment at appearing with me?" The question was delivered calmly, but Charles heard the blade beneath the words. "Your comfort," he said, and meant it. "I have no illusions about what will be said, and I have no desire to subject you to it unnecessarily. What will be said is already being said, with or without our presence," Isabella replied. "My father informed me in his last letter that the gossip has been quite energetic. Apparently I have variously been described as a scheming merchant's daughter who trapped you, a pathetic creature you pitied enough to rescue, and in one particularly colorful version, a secret beauty whose charms you could not resist." She smiled thinly. "Only one of those is remotely accurate." "None of them are accurate," Charles said with sudden vehemence. "You did not trap me. I made a choice, a calculated choice based on circumstance, but a choice nonetheless. You have nothing to be ashamed of." "Nor do you," Isabella said, her grey eyes steady on his. "You did what was necessary to preserve your family's legacy. That is admirable, not shameful. If society wishes to judge us for it, let them. We know the truth of what we are." "And what are we?" Charles asked, genuinely curious. Isabella considered the question, tilting her head slightly. "Partners, I suppose. Two people making the best of a bargain neither would have chosen but both can live with. Is that not sufficient?" It should have been. It should have been more than sufficient. But somewhere in the past months, Charles had begun to want something more than sufficiency. He wanted, what? Her genuine smile, not the polite one she showed in company. Her real thoughts, not the measured responses she calculated for safety. Her trust, her affection. Things she had every right to withhold given how he had treated her, given the cold transaction that had bound them together. "We will go to London," he said decisively, "and we will face whatever gossip awaits us together. You deserve to take your place in society, Isabella. You have earned it." It was the first time he had used her given name, and he saw her eyes widen slightly at the intimacy of it. Something passed between them, fragile and unspoken, before she nodded. "Very well, Your Grace. To London, then." The journey took 2 days, and they travelled in Charles's best carriage with 2 outriders and enough luggage to establish Isabella properly in town. They stayed at the Pembroke townhouse, which Isabella immediately set about making livable after months of neglect. Charles watched her direct servants, review accounts, and transform the dusty, closed-up rooms into something warm and welcoming, and felt a surge of pride that surprised him with its intensity. The night of the Ashford ball, Charles dressed with unusual care, checking his appearance multiple times in the mirror and feeling absurdly nervous. When Isabella emerged from her dressing room, he felt his breath catch. She wore a gown of deep blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes and made her skin glow. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style he had never seen before, with small diamonds glittering among the dark waves. She looked every inch a duchess, beautiful and elegant and utterly out of his reach. "Will I do?" she asked with a slight smile, as though reading his thoughts. "You will more than do," Charles managed. You look beautiful, Isabella." Color rose in her cheeks, and for just a moment she looked pleased, genuinely pleased, before the careful mask slipped back into place. "Thank you, Your Grace. Shall we?" The Ashford ballroom was ablaze with light and crowded with everyone who mattered in London society. Charles felt the attention shift to them the moment they were announced, felt the weight of hundreds of eyes assessing, judging, whispering. He kept his face carefully neutral, his posture perfect, but his hand on Isabella's arm tightened protectively. "Pembroke, what a delight to see you." Lord Ashford boomed, approaching with his wife in tow. "And the new Duchess, of course. How lovely you look, my dear. That gown is exquisite." "Thank you, my lord," Isabella said with perfect composure, curtsying gracefully. Lady Ashford's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "You must tell us, Your Grace. How are you finding married life? Such a change from Bloomsbury, I imagine." It was a veiled insult, a reminder of Isabella's origins wrapped in the language of polite inquiry. Charles felt anger flash through him, but before he could respond, Isabella spoke, her voice calm and pleasant. "Indeed it is, Lady Ashford. I find the countryside so much more peaceful than London, and Pembroke Hall is a magnificent estate. The Duke has been most generous in allowing me to assist with its management. I do so enjoy having meaningful work to occupy my time, rather than filling my days with idle gossip and social calls." The words were delivered with such sweet innocence that it took Lady Ashford a moment to realize she had just been insulted in return. Charles felt something dangerously close to laughter building in his chest. He coughed to cover it, then smoothly guided Isabella away toward the refreshment table. "Well played," he murmured for her ears alone. "I did warn you I would not shame your name," Isabella replied, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing servant. "That does not mean I will allow others to shame mine." They were approached by a steady stream of acquaintances throughout the evening, some genuinely welcoming, others transparently curious. Through it all, Isabella maintained her poise, responding to questions with just enough information to satisfy without revealing anything truly personal. Charles found himself admiring her skill, the way she navigated the treacherous waters of high society, despite having no training in its particular cruelties. He was standing with a group of fellow lords, half listening to a tedious discussion about hunting season, when he heard a familiar laugh from across the room. He turned and felt his stomach drop. Lady Catherine Thornwood stood near the windows, beautiful and dangerous in crimson silk, watching him with eyes that glittered with malice. Catherine had been his mistress 3 years ago, before the money troubles became acute, before he had been forced to end the arrangement. She had not taken the dismissal well, and Charles had heard rumors that she blamed him for her subsequent failed engagement to Lord Waverley. He had hoped to avoid her tonight, but apparently fate had other plans. She swept toward him with deliberate purpose, ignoring Isabella completely. "Charles, how wonderful to see you. It has been far too long." "Lady Catherine," Charles said stiffly, bowing with minimal courtesy. "May I present my wife, the Duchess of Pembroke?" Catherine's eyes flicked to Isabella with barely concealed contempt. "Of course, how lovely. You must be so proud, Charles, marrying so advantageously." The emphasis on the last word was impossible to miss. Charles felt his jaw tighten, but Isabella spoke before he could respond. "Indeed, Lady Catherine, my husband has been most generous in overlooking my common origins, just as I have been generous in overlooking his past indiscretions." She smiled pleasantly, but her eyes were ice. "I find that mutual generosity is the foundation of any successful marriage. Do you not agree?" Catherine's face flushed an unattractive red. "I am sure I don't know what you mean." "No?" Isabella tilted her head innocently. "How curious. I was under the impression you were quite familiar with the concept of indiscretion, but perhaps I am mistaken. Do excuse me." I see Lady Thornbury beckoning. "Your Grace." She extended her hand to Charles, who took it gratefully and allowed her to lead him away from Catherine's stunned expression. Once they were out of earshot, Charles leaned down to whisper, "That was remarkable." "That was necessary," Isabella corrected. "She was trying to humiliate you through me. I merely reminded her that two can play at that game." "You knew about Catherine." "I know about all of them, Your Grace. Did you think I would enter this marriage completely ignorant of your history? My father may be a merchant, but he is an excellent one. He investigates before he invests." There was something brittle in Isabella's voice now, something that might have been hurt buried beneath layers of pragmatism. Charles felt shame wash over him. Of course she knew. Of course she had been informed of every affair, every gambling debt, every failure that had led him to her door. How could he have imagined otherwise? "Isabella, do not," she said quietly but firmly, "do not apologize for your past. You have kept your word to me since our marriage. You have treated me with respect and courtesy. That is all I asked, and it is all I require." But Charles found himself wanting to apologize anyway, wanting to explain that Catherine had meant nothing, that none of them had meant anything beyond temporary distraction from the slow-motion catastrophe his life had become. He wanted to tell Isabella that in the months since their marriage, he had not thought of another woman, had not wanted another woman, had in fact found himself thinking of her with increasing frequency and disturbing intensity. But the words stuck in his throat, held back by pride and fear, and the terrible suspicion that she would not believe him anyway. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced conversation and barely concealed scrutiny. By the time their carriage pulled away from the Ashford residence, Charles was exhausted from the effort of maintaining his composure. Isabella sat across from him in the darkness, silent and still, and he could not read her expression. "You were magnificent tonight," he said finally, because the silence was unbearable. "You handled every situation with perfect grace. You made me proud." Isabella turned to look at him, and in the flickering light from the carriage lamps, he saw something raw and vulnerable flash across her face before she controlled it. "Did I? How gratifying. Though I suspect you were simply relieved I did not embarrass you." "That is not fair," Charles said, leaning forward. "That is not what I meant at all." "Then what did you mean, Your Grace?" There was challenge in her voice now, an edge he had never heard before. "What exactly am I to you? A useful manager of your estate? A tolerable dinner companion? A body that legitimizes your heir? I have played every role you required of me without complaint, but please do not insult me by pretending tonight was anything more than a successful public performance." The words hit Charles like physical blows. Was that truly what she thought? That their growing friendship, their conversations, the small moments of connection, were all just performance? Or worse, was she right? Had he been so caught up in his own confused feelings that he had failed to show her anything real? "You are my wife," he said, the inadequacy of the statement apparent even as he spoke it. "Yes," Isabella said flatly. "I am your wife, purchased for £150,000 and assorted properties, a transaction you have honored with admirable consistency. I do not know why I expected or hoped." She stopped abruptly, turning her face away to look out the window at the dark London streets. "Hoped for what?" Charles pressed, his heart hammering. "Isabella, hoped for what?" "Nothing," she said, her voice carefully neutral again, all emotion locked away. "I hoped for nothing. That was our agreement, was it not? No expectations, no burdens, no messy emotions, just respect and courtesy, and the smooth operation of a mutually beneficial arrangement. I apologize for my lapse. It will not happen again." The carriage pulled up to the townhouse before Charles could respond. Isabella descended without waiting for his assistance and swept into the house, leaving him standing on the pavement, feeling as though he had just lost something precious that he had not even known he possessed. Sleep eluded him that night. He lay in his bed listening to the sounds of the house settling around him and replaying the conversation in the carriage over and over. Isabella had wanted something more. She had hoped for something, and he had failed to give it to her, failed even to recognize that she might want anything beyond the cold terms of their agreement. He had been so careful to maintain his distance, so determined to protect himself from the vulnerability of caring, that he had not noticed she might be protecting herself as well. When had she stopped being simply a solution to his financial problems and become, what? Someone he looked forward to seeing at breakfast. Someone whose opinions mattered to him. Someone whose absence from a room made that room feel empty and wrong. Someone he wanted to make smile, truly smile, not with polite courtesy but with genuine pleasure. When had he fallen in love with his own wife? The realization struck him with the force of revelation, obvious and terrible and undeniable. He loved her quick mind and her hidden kindness, her strength and her carefully guarded vulnerability. Loved the way she played piano when she thought no one was listening, the way she spoke to servants as equals, the way she had defended him tonight against Catherine's malice. Loved her so completely that the thought of continuing their cold, courteous marriage for the rest of their lives felt like a prison sentence. But what did she feel? She had said she hoped for something, but what? Affection? Love? Or simply less loneliness, less isolation? A marriage that resembled something more than a business arrangement? And even if she had once wanted more, had he destroyed that possibility by his coldness, by treating her exactly as she had asked to be treated, with respect and nothing else? Morning found Charles hollow-eyed and determined. He dressed with care and went down to breakfast early, hoping to speak with Isabella before the day's obligations intruded. But when he arrived at the breakfast room, the footman informed him that Her Grace had already eaten and departed to call on Lady Thornbury, who had extended an invitation the previous evening. Charles spent the day in his study, attempting to focus on correspondence and failing miserably. His mind kept returning to Isabella, to the hurt in her voice, to his own belated realization. He needed to talk to her, to tell her, what? That he had been a fool, that he wanted to renegotiate their agreement, that he loved her and hoped desperately that she might feel something for him in return. The words sounded absurd even in his own head, the desperate confession of a man who had squandered his chance at happiness through his own cowardice. Isabella did not return until late afternoon, and when she did, she was accompanied by Lady Thornbury's daughter, Miss Alice Thornbury, a cheerful young woman who chatted about the sights of London with exhausting enthusiasm. Charles greeted them politely but found himself irritated by the intrusion. He wanted to speak with Isabella alone, but she seemed determined to avoid any such opportunity, engaging Miss Thornbury in conversation and pleading fatigue when the girl finally departed. "Isabella," Charles said as she turned toward the stairs, "might I speak with you just for a moment?" She paused, her hand on the banister, not looking at him. "I am quite tired, Your Grace. Perhaps tomorrow?" "Please," he said, and something in his voice must have reached her because she stopped and slowly turned to face him. "Very well. In the drawing room?" They entered the drawing room with its familiar furniture and the pianoforte, where he had first heard her play. Charles closed the door behind them, aware that this was slightly improper but needing the privacy nonetheless. Isabella stood near the window, her posture perfect, her face composed, and he wanted to shake her until that careful mask fell away. "I owe you an apology," he began, the words he had rehearsed all day suddenly inadequate. "Last night in the carriage, you said you had hoped for something, and I responded poorly. I have responded poorly to many things since our marriage, and I need you to understand why." "You do not need to explain," Isabella said quietly. "I understand perfectly well. You married me for my money. That was never in question. I should not have allowed myself to forget it." "But you did forget it," Charles said, taking a step toward her. "Just as I did. Isabella, when did you start to forget?" She looked away, her fingers twisting together in a gesture of agitation he had never seen from her. "It does not matter. It matters to me. Please." "When?" "The night of the storm," she said finally, the words barely audible. "When you worked alongside the servants to protect the house, when you spoke to me as though my opinion mattered, as though I was more than just a useful addition to your household. I knew better than to read anything into it, but I am not as immune to hope as I pretended to be." Charles felt something break open in his chest. "And I gave you no reason to hope. I kept you at a distance because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Isabella asked, finally looking at him with those clear grey eyes that saw too much. "Afraid of this," Charles said desperately. "Afraid of wanting something I had no right to ask for. I married you for your money, Isabella. That is the truth we both know. I took your fortune to save my estate and my name, and in return I promised you respect and courtesy and nothing more. How could I then turn around and ask for your affection, your trust, your love, when the foundation of our marriage was a transaction? What right did I have to want more? What right did either of us have?" Isabella whispered, and there were tears on her cheeks now, the first tears he had ever seen her shed. "You offered me a bargain, Charles. No expectations, no burdens, no messy emotions. I agreed because I thought it was all I could have, all I deserved. My father's money buying me a title because no one would want me for myself. But then you spoke to me as though I had a mind worth engaging. You asked my opinions as though they mattered. You made me feel seen for the first time in my life, And God help me, I fell in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, irrevocable and transforming. Charles closed the distance between them in 2 strides, taking her hands in his, feeling them tremble. "Say that again." "Why?" Isabella asked, trying to pull away. "So you can feel guilty? So you can offer me pity?" "I do not want your pity, Charles. I want—" "What do you want?" He tightened his grip on her hands, holding her there, holding her close. "Tell me what you want, Isabella." "I want you to love me back," she said, the words breaking on a sob. "I want this marriage to be real. I want to matter to you as more than a solution to your financial problems. I want you to look at me the way you did tonight when I defended you against Lady Catherine, as though I was something precious and worth protecting. I want impossibly, foolishly, to be loved by the man I love." Charles pulled her into his arms, feeling her stiffen with surprise before she collapsed against him, her tears soaking his shirt. He held her tightly, one hand cradling her head, the other wrapped around her waist, and felt his own eyes burning. "You are loved," he said fiercely. "Isabella, you are loved. I have been a blind fool, but I see you now. I see how strong you are, how kind, how brilliant. I see how you transformed my house into a home, how you won the respect of everyone from the servants to the tenants, how you faced London society with more courage than I have ever possessed. I see you, and I love you desperately." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Truly?" "Truly," Charles said, and then, because words were insufficient, he kissed her. It was nothing like the cold performance of their wedding night, nothing like duty or obligation. It was desperate and tender and full of all the longing he had been denying for months. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt, her body pressed against his, and Charles felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble into dust. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Isabella laughed, a sound of pure joy that Charles had never heard from her before. "I thought I was going mad," she said. "Falling in love with a man who had married me for my fortune, it seemed like the height of foolishness. No more foolish than me falling in love with my own wife and being too proud and stupid to admit it," Charles said, brushing the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. "I wasted months we could have had together because I was afraid. Then let us waste no more time," Isabella said, rising on her toes to kiss him again. "Let us begin again, properly this time, not as strangers bound by a contract, but as husband and wife who choose each other freely." "Yes," Charles agreed, the words simple and complete and full of promise. Yes, they talked late into the night, sharing the thoughts and feelings they had kept hidden, dismantling the careful distance between them with words and touches and long silences that were comfortable rather than strained. Charles told her about his father's cruelty, his fear of becoming the same man, his desperate need to save the estate, not just for pride, but for the people who depended on it. Isabella told him about her loneliness growing up, about being neither wealthy enough for high society nor common enough for the middle class, about her mother's death and her father's relentless social climbing that left her feeling like a commodity rather than a daughter. "I thought if I made myself useful enough, indispensable enough, you might at least respect me, even if you could never love me," she confessed. "I thought that would be enough." "I do respect you," Charles said, holding her close on the settee where they had ended up, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "But it is far from the only thing I feel. You have made me want to be better, to be worthy of you. Everything good I have done since our marriage, I have done at least partly to earn your approval." "You already had my approval," Isabella said softly. "You had my heart almost from the beginning, though I tried so hard to protect it. You were kinder than you wanted anyone to know. I saw how you worried about the tenants, how you made sure the servants were fairly treated, how you struggled with estate decisions because you wanted to do right by everyone. You thought you were being cold and distant, but I saw through it." They fell asleep there together, wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time since their marriage began, Charles felt truly at peace. The morning light found them still entwined, and Isabella's smile when she woke was like sunshine breaking through clouds. They returned to Pembroke Hall the next day, and Charles made it clear to the servants that the Duchess was to be treated not just with respect, but with the deference due to her position as the true mistress of the house and, more importantly, as the woman he loved. The change in their relationship was obvious to everyone. Charles sought Isabella's company constantly, joining her for her morning walks through the gardens, sitting with her in the evenings while she played piano, asking her advice on every aspect of estate management, not because he had to, but because he valued her judgment. They dined together and laughed together and found endless things to talk about. The cold, formal marriage transformed into something warm and vital and deeply happy. But happiness, Charles learned, could be fragile. It was in May when the letter arrived. Charles had been going through the Morning Post in his study when he saw the seal, the crest of the Marquess of Ashworth, one of the most powerful peers in England. He opened it with curiosity that quickly turned to ice as he read the contents. The letter was brief and brutal. The Marquess had recently reviewed his investment portfolio and discovered that one of his major holdings was a shipping company, Fairchild Maritime, the source of Isabella's fortune. Unfortunately, the company was now facing serious allegations: illegal smuggling operations, falsified customs documents, bribery of port officials. An investigation was underway, and if the charges proved true, anyone associated with Fairchild Maritime could face criminal prosecution, including family members who had benefited from the ill-gotten gains. The implications were clear. Isabella's dowry, the money that had saved Pembroke Hall, might be the proceeds of criminal activity. And if that were proven, everything could be seized. The money, the properties, everything. Worse, the scandal would destroy them both. Charles might lose his seat in the House of Lords, might be stripped of his title, might face legal consequences himself for receiving stolen funds. Charles sat staring at the letter for a long time, feeling the world tilt beneath him. This could not be happening. Not now, not when he had finally found happiness. Not when he had finally learned to love and be loved in return. He thought of Isabella, of her kindness and intelligence, and the joy that had transformed her face over the past weeks. How could he tell her that her father's business, the source of the wealth that had defined her entire life, was built on crime? He stood and walked to the window, trying to think clearly through the rising panic. There had to be a solution. There had to be a way to protect Isabella from this, to shield her from the consequences of her father's actions. But what? If he tried to return the money, it would be an admission of guilt. If he kept it and the charges were proven, they would both be destroyed. A knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Come," he called, not turning from the window. "Your Grace, Mrs. Davison asked me to inform you that Her Grace has returned from her visit to the village and will be joining you for luncheon," the footman said. "Thank you," Charles managed, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Tell her I will be there shortly." The footman departed, and Charles looked down at the letter in his hand. He should tell Isabella immediately, should show her the accusations and discuss how to proceed. They were partners now, husband and wife in truth, not just in name. She had a right to know. But when he saw her at luncheon, radiant and smiling as she told him about her visit with the vicar's wife, he found he could not speak the words. Not yet. Not until he knew more. He smiled and nodded and pushed food around his plate, while his mind raced through possibilities and consequences. Over the following days, Charles made discreet inquiries through his solicitor. What he learned was deeply troubling. The investigation was being led by Sir Edmund Blackwell, a notoriously ambitious prosecutor who had built his career on bringing down wealthy criminals. The evidence against Fairchild Maritime was substantial and well documented. Smuggled goods, primarily luxury items from the continent, had been moved through Fairchild warehouses for years, avoiding customs duties and enriching the company enormously. The bribes had been extensive and methodical, reaching high into the Port Authority. "I must be frank with you, Your Grace," Mr. Whitmore said during one such consultation. "If these charges are proven, and it seems likely they will be, Mr. Fairchild will face imprisonment, his assets will be seized, and anyone who has benefited from those assets, including yourself and the Duchess, will be thoroughly investigated. At best, you would be required to return all monies received. At worst, you could be charged as an accessory after the fact." "I had no knowledge of any criminal activity," Charles said sharply. "Neither did my wife." "That may well be true, Your Grace, but proving it will be difficult. The law takes a dim view of those who profit from crime, whether knowingly or otherwise. And I fear the court of public opinion will be even harsher. The scandal alone could be ruinous." Charles dismissed the solicitor and sat in his study, head in hands, trying to find a path forward. He could flee to the continent with Isabella, live in exile as so many disgraced aristocrats had done before, but that would mean abandoning the estate, abandoning the tenants who depended on him, admitting guilt he did not possess. He could fight the charges in court, but that would subject Isabella to public scrutiny and shame, dragging her through trial after trial, while society tore her apart. He could try to negotiate with Sir Edmund, but men like that did not negotiate, they only prosecuted. Every option seemed impossible. Every path led to destruction. And through it all, Isabella smiled at him over breakfast, walked with him through the gardens, played piano in the evenings while he pretended to read. She had no idea that the happiness they had found was built on foundations of sand, that the money which had saved them might be the very thing that destroyed them. A week after receiving the letter, Charles was summoned to London by a note from Sir Edmund Blackwell himself. He told Isabella he had business with his solicitor, hating the lie but unable to speak the truth, and took the fastest carriage to town. The meeting was held in Sir Edmund's offices, a grim room lined with law books and smelling of old paper and ambition. Sir Edmund was a thin man with sharp features and eyes that missed nothing. He gestured for Charles to sit and got directly to business. "Your Grace, I am sure you understand why I have requested this meeting. My investigation into Fairchild Maritime has progressed substantially, and your name has, inevitably, come to my attention." "I have committed no crime," Charles said firmly. "I married Miss Fairchild in good faith, with no knowledge of any illegal activities associated with her father's business." "Perhaps," Sir Edmund said, tapping his fingers on a stack of documents. "But ignorance is not always a defense, particularly when one has benefited so substantially from criminal proceeds. The dowry you received was, by our calculations, approximately £150,000, plus significant property holdings. That money was earned through systematic fraud and smuggling operations spanning at least a decade." "What do you want from me?" Charles asked bluntly. "Cooperation," Sir Edmund said simply. "Mr. Fairchild has been most uncooperative, refusing to name his accomplices or provide detailed accounts of his operations. You, however, are in a unique position. As his son-in-law, you have access to family information, business documents, perhaps even direct knowledge of operations. If you were to assist my investigation, provide testimony, help me build a comprehensive case, I would be inclined to view your involvement as unfortunate circumstance rather than willing participation." Charles felt cold fury rise in his chest. "You want me to testify against my wife's father, to betray my own family for your career advancement? I want justice, Your Grace." Sir Edmund said coldly, "Mr. Fairchild has stolen from the Crown, corrupted public officials, and enriched himself through criminal enterprise. He will be prosecuted and imprisoned. The only question is whether you will be imprisoned alongside him, whether your wife will be publicly shamed as the daughter of a convicted criminal, whether your estate will be seized to repay the Crown for stolen customs revenue, or whether you will be seen as a victim who cooperated fully with authorities to expose wrongdoing. The choice was brutal and clear. Betray Mr. Fairchild and save himself and Isabella from the worst consequences, or stand by family and face complete destruction. I need time to consider," Charles said, his voice tight. "You have 1 week," Sir Edmund replied. "After that, I will proceed with or without your cooperation. And I assure you, Your Grace, I will not be merciful to those who obstruct justice." Charles returned to Pembroke Hall feeling as though he were walking through a nightmare. He now had 7 days to make an impossible choice, to betray family or to sacrifice everything he and Isabella had built together. And he still had not told Isabella any of it. How could he? How could he look into her eyes and tell her that her father was a criminal? That the money that had defined her entire life was stolen? That Charles had to choose between destroying her father and destroying them both? He found her in the garden, cutting roses for the dinner table. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and her smile was like a knife to his heart. "Charles, you are back early. How was London? Did your business go well?" "Well enough," he lied, the words choking him. "Isabella, there is something I need to discuss with you." She must have heard something in his voice because her smile faded, replaced by concern. "What is it? You look terrible. Are you ill?" No, not ill. Come, let us sit." He led her to a bench beneath an old oak tree, and for a long moment he simply held her hand, trying to find words for the impossible. "There has been A development concerning your father's business. Isabella's face went still. What kind of development? Charles withdrew the letter from Sir Edmund and handed it to her. He watched her face as she read, watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched her hands begin to tremble. When she finished, she sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. "Is it true?" she finally whispered. "Could it be true?" "I do not know," Charles said gently. "The evidence seems substantial, but I have not seen it all. Isabella, did you ever suspect anything? Did your father ever say anything that might suggest—" "No," she said sharply, then more quietly. "No, I knew nothing. I swear to you, Charles, I had no idea. My father, he was always so proud of his business, so determined to be legitimate and respected. He talked constantly about rising above his origins, about building something clean and respectable. I thought," her voice broke, "I thought that was what he had done." Charles pulled her into his arms, feeling her shaking with silent sobs. "I believe you. I do. But Isabella, there is more. Sir Edmund has requested my cooperation in the investigation. He wants me to provide testimony, to help build the case against your father, and in return, he is offering to treat us as victims rather than accomplices." Isabella pulled back, her eyes wide with horror. "He wants you to betray my father, to help send him to prison." "Yes, and if you refuse? Then we face prosecution ourselves. The dowry could be seized, the properties confiscated, our names dragged through scandal. We could lose everything, Isabella. The estate, my title, possibly even our freedom." She stood abruptly, walking a few paces away, her arms wrapped around herself. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "What will you do?" Charles stood and went to her, turning her gently to face him. "What we will do. This is not my decision alone, Isabella. He is your father. It is your money that is in question. I will not make this choice without you. But it is your estate at stake," Isabella said, tears streaming down her face. "Your title, your legacy, everything you fought so hard to save. I will not ask you to sacrifice that for my father, especially if he truly did these things. And I will not ask you to sacrifice your father for my convenience," Charles replied fiercely. "We are partners, remember? We face this together, whatever we decide." They talked late into the night, weighing options that all felt like different forms of betrayal. If they cooperated with Sir Edmund, they would condemn Mr. Fairchild, but might save themselves. If they refused, they would face ruin but would maintain their integrity and family loyalty. If they tried to fight the charges in court, they would spend years and a fortune in legal fees with no guarantee of success. "I need to speak with my father," Isabella said finally as dawn began to break. "I need to hear from him directly whether these charges are true. I need to look him in the eye and ask him if he built his empire on crime, if he used my dowry as a way to launder stolen money through a respectable marriage. I need to know." Charles arranged for them to travel to London the next day to meet with Mr. Fairchild, who was being held under house arrest pending formal charges. The Fairchild residence in Bloomsbury, once so proudly appointed, now had the grim atmosphere of a prison. Guards stood at the door, and the servants moved about with frightened, furtive expressions. Mr. Fairchild received them in his study, and Charles was shocked by the change in the man. He seemed to have aged a decade in the weeks since Charles had last seen him, his broad shoulders slumped, his shrewd eyes dimmed with fear and something that might have been shame. When he saw Isabella, his face crumpled. "My dear girl," he said hoarsely, "I never wanted, you were never supposed to know." "So it is true," Isabella said, her voice breaking. "All of it. The smuggling, the bribes, everything." Mr. Fairchild sank into his chair, suddenly looking ancient. "Yes, God help me, yes, it is true. I told myself I was just evening the odds, that the taxes were unfair and everyone did it. I told myself I was building something for you, something that would give you opportunities I never had. I told myself so many lies that I stopped knowing what was truth." "How long?" Charles asked. "How long has this been going on?" 15 years, maybe more," Fairchild said dully. "It started small, just a few shipments here and there, but it was so profitable, and I was so good at it. I expanded the operations, brought in partners, built the whole enterprise. The legitimate business exists, but it has always been cover for the rest. Everything you have, everything I gave you, Isabella, it is all tainted." Isabella made a small, wounded sound, and Charles moved closer to her, his hand on her back in support. "They want me to testify against you," Charles said bluntly. "They want me to provide evidence and cooperation in exchange for lenient treatment for Isabella and myself." "You should do it," Fairchild said immediately. "You should save yourselves. I am finished regardless. They have the documents, the testimony from the port officials I bribed, everything. I will go to prison, probably for the rest of my life. But you are young. You have a chance. Do not let my sins destroy you both." "He is my father," Isabella whispered to Charles. "How can I let you condemn him?" "He is already condemned," Fairchild said heavily, "by his own actions, by his own greed. Isabella, listen to me. I did terrible things. I broke the law. I corrupted good men. I built my fortune on theft and lies. I deserve what is coming to me. But you do not. You are innocent in this, both of you. You must protect yourselves." They left the Fairchild house in silence, both struggling with the weight of impossible decisions. That evening, in their rooms at the townhouse, Isabella finally spoke what Charles suspected she had been thinking all day. "If we cooperate with Sir Edmund, society will say I manipulated you. They will say I used my father's criminal money to trap a duke, that I was part of the scheme all along. They will destroy my reputation and question our marriage, question everything we have built together. But if we do not cooperate, we lose everything anyway." "I do not care what society says," Charles said fiercely, taking her hands. "Let them talk. Let them speculate. I know the truth. You are the best person I have ever known, Isabella. You are kind and intelligent and honest to your core. No scandal can change that. No gossip can diminish it. But your title," Isabella protested, "your family legacy, the estate. I cannot be the reason you lose all of that, Charles. I cannot live with that burden." Charles pulled her close, cradling her head against his chest. "Listen to me. When I married you, I thought the estate was everything. I thought preserving the Pembroke name and lands was the only thing that mattered. But you taught me differently. You taught me that how we treat people matters more than what we own. You taught me that integrity and kindness are worth more than titles and property. If we lose Pembroke Hall tomorrow, I will be devastated. But I will survive it, as long as I have you. Because you, Isabella, you are what matters now. Not the estate, not the title, you." She looked up at him with eyes full of tears and love and terrible fear. "I do not know what to do. Every choice feels wrong." "Then let me make it," Charles said softly. "Let me choose for both of us. I will not cooperate with Sir Edmund. I will not testify against your father or provide evidence for his prosecution. Whatever happens, we face it together with our integrity intact. But the estate will survive or it will not," Charles said firmly. "But I will not build our future on betrayal, Isabella. I married you for your money once, and it has been the shame of my life. I will not compound that shame by turning on your family when circumstances become difficult. We will find another way." Isabella buried her face in his chest and wept, great shaking sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Charles held her through it all, making soothing sounds, stroking her hair, and trying to believe his own brave words. He had just committed them to a path that might end in complete ruin, but he could not regret it. Some things, he was learning, were more important than estates and titles. Some things, like honor and love and standing by the person you loved, those things mattered more than all the grand halls and ancient names in England. The next day, Charles sent word to Sir Edmund Blackwell that he would not be cooperating with the investigation. The response was swift and predictable. Within a week, Charles received formal notice that he was being called to testify before a grand jury investigating criminal activity related to Fairchild Maritime. Refusal to testify could result in contempt charges. The dowry was being frozen pending resolution of the case. All properties transferred as part of the marriage settlement were subject to potential seizure. The scandal broke across London like a summer storm, sudden and devastating. The newspapers, always eager for aristocratic downfall, ran wild with speculation. The Duke of Pembroke had married a criminal's daughter for her dirty money. The Duchess was a schemer who had entrapped a desperate nobleman. The Fairchild fortune was built on theft and corruption. The Pembrokes would be ruined, stripped of everything, and it was no more than they deserved for their greed. Letters arrived from Charles's fellow lords, some expressing sympathy but most distancing themselves from the scandal. Invitations dried up overnight. The servants at the townhouse began seeking new positions, fearing the household would soon be dissolved. Even Mr. Whitmore, loyal for so many years, gently suggested that Charles consider a legal separation from Isabella to minimize his exposure to her father's crimes. "Absolutely not," Charles said coldly. "My wife is innocent of any wrongdoing, and I will not abandon her to face this alone. Your Grace, I understand your loyalty, but you must consider the practical realities," Whitmore pleaded. "If you maintain your marriage, you will be associated with this scandal forever. Your children, should you have any, will carry this taint. But if you separate now, claim you were deceived, you might salvage something." "Get out," Charles said quietly, dangerously. "Get out of my house, and do not come back. You are dismissed from my service." Whitmore left, and Charles sat alone in his study, staring at the walls that might soon belong to someone else. He heard footsteps in the hallway, and knew without looking that it was Isabella. She entered without knocking, her face pale but composed. "I heard what Whitmore said," she told him, "and I heard your response. Charles, he is right. If you divorce me, claim you were a victim of my father's schemes, you could save yourself. I would not blame you. I would understand." Charles stood and crossed to her, taking her face gently in his hands. "Do you remember what you said to me in the garden all those months ago? You said you expected respect and courtesy and basic human dignity. Do you know what I expect now?" She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I expect to grow old with you," Charles said softly. "I expect to face whatever comes next together. I expect to love you for the rest of my life, scandal or not, estate or not, title or not. You are my wife, Isabella, not because of a contract or a dowry or social obligation, but because I choose you. Every day, I choose you. Even if it costs you everything?" "You are everything," Charles said simply, and kissed her. The trial of Mr. Fairchild was swift and brutal. The evidence was overwhelming, and despite his lawyer's best efforts, he was convicted on all charges. The sentence was 20 years imprisonment and complete forfeiture of all assets. The judge, in his closing remarks, spoke sternly about men who corrupted honest business and betrayed the public trust. Mr. Fairchild was led away in chains, a broken man who had aged another decade in the months since his arrest. Isabella attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery with her head high despite the whispers and stares. Charles sat beside her, his hand holding hers, silently declaring his support to everyone who cared to notice. When the verdict was read, Isabella did not flinch, though Charles felt her hand tighten in his. The aftermath was complicated and painful. The Crown seized the Fairchild assets, including the dowry that had been paid to Charles. Sir Edmund Blackwell, true to his word, pursued charges against Charles and Isabella for receiving stolen property. The case dragged through the courts for months, during which Charles and Isabella lived in a strange limbo, not quite ruined, but certainly not secure. In the end, it was Charles's testimony that saved them. He stood before the court and spoke with absolute honesty about the circumstances of his marriage, about his financial desperation, about his ignorance of Mr. Fairchild's criminal activities. But more importantly, he spoke about Isabella, about her character, her intelligence, her complete lack of knowledge regarding her father's crimes. He spoke about how she had transformed his estate through honest management, how she had won the loyalty and respect of everyone who knew her, how she was the best person he had ever known and deserved none of the shame being heaped upon her. "My lords," Charles said in his closing statement, his voice ringing through the courtroom, "I married Isabella Fairchild for her money. That is a truth I cannot deny, and one I am not proud of. But what I found in that marriage was something far more valuable than any fortune. I found a partner, a companion, and a woman of such integrity that she humbles me daily. If loving her is a crime, then I am guilty. But profiting from her father's crimes, of that we are both innocent. We were victims of his deceptions just as surely as the Crown was, and we have paid a price far higher than money. We have paid with our reputations, our peace, and very nearly our future. I ask this court not for mercy but for justice, and justice demands that the innocent not be punished for the guilty man's sins." The judges deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, they found Charles and Isabella not guilty of criminal wrongdoing, though the civil judgment required them to return what remained of the dowry to the Crown. It was a Pyrrhic victory. They were cleared of criminality but financially devastated, and the social damage was irreparable. They returned to Pembroke Hall with almost nothing. The dowry was gone, the additional properties had been seized, and the estate was once again in financial crisis, though not quite as dire as before. Charles had managed to use the initial influx of capital to make improvements that generated income, and the tenants were more productive than they had been in years. But it would be difficult, perhaps impossible, to maintain their position in society. "We could sell the townhouse," Isabella suggested one evening as they reviewed the accounts together. "It would give us some breathing room." "No," Charles said firmly, "we will find another way. I will not sell my grandfather's house." "Then I will sell my jewelry," Isabella said. "Most of it was bought with tainted money anyway. I do not want to wear it." "Isabella—" "Charles, please," she interrupted gently. "Let me contribute. Let me help save what we can. We are partners, remember? Let me be your partner in this." So they sold the jewelry, sold some furnishings, economized everywhere they could. Charles dismissed half the servants, though he made sure they had good references and severance pay. Isabella learned to manage with a much smaller household staff, often doing work herself that would have been unthinkable for a duchess of her station. They ate simple meals, wore last season's clothes, and forgot all the social luxuries that had once defined their class. It was hard. Some days it was brutally, exhaustingly hard, but they did it together, and somehow that made it bearable. More than bearable sometimes, in the quiet moments when Charles watched Isabella kneading bread in the kitchen alongside the cook, or when she looked up from the account books and smiled at him, he felt something that might have been happiness. True happiness, not dependent on money or status or the approval of society, but rooted in the simple fact of being together. The invitations never returned. London society had made its judgment, and that judgment was exile. The Pembrokes were tainted by scandal, acceptable in legal terms perhaps, but socially unforgivable. Some of Charles's former friends cut him openly in the street. Others simply pretended not to see him. It stung, but Isabella's steady presence made it endurable. "They were never truly your friends if they abandoned you so easily," she said one evening after a particularly painful encounter. "Real friends, real people, they stand by you when things are difficult. Everyone else is just scenery." Charles laughed despite himself. "Scenery? Background decoration," Isabella said with a small smile. "Pretty to look at, but ultimately unimportant. We do not need them, Charles. We have each other, we have the estate, we have work that matters. What more do we need?" As it turned out, they needed very little. Over the next few years, Charles and Isabella built a life that looked nothing like what either had imagined, but was deeply satisfying nonetheless. They worked the estate together, implementing improvements, supporting the tenants, slowly building back stability. They had children, 3 of them eventually, who grew up knowing that their parents loved each other and that honest work was nothing to be ashamed of. The scandal never entirely faded. Even years later, there were whispers, reminders, the occasional cruel remark. But Charles and Isabella had learned to live with it, had learned that the opinions of people who did not know them mattered far less than their own knowledge of who they were and what they had overcome. One autumn evening, nearly 10 years after their marriage, Charles found Isabella in the music room playing the pianoforte. Their youngest child, a daughter named Catherine, sat beside her on the bench, learning the notes. Charles stood in the doorway watching them, his heart full of a contentment he could never have imagined in those early days when he had married a stranger for her fortune. Isabella looked up and saw him, and her smile was radiant, genuine, full of all the love they had fought so hard to preserve. She said something to Catherine, who giggled and ran to hug her father before scampering off to find her brothers. Isabella rose and crossed to Charles, slipping easily into his arms. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, reading the expression on his face. "I was thinking about the day I met you," Charles said honestly, "about how I saw you sitting in the corner at that ball, saying nothing to anyone, and thought you were forgettable." "I was forgettable," Isabella said with a laugh. "Deliberately so. I was terrified and trying not to be noticed." "You were never forgettable," Charles said, kissing her forehead. "I was just too blind to see it. Isabella, if I could go back, if I could change how we began—" "I would not change anything," Isabella interrupted, placing her fingers over his lips. "Not the scandal, not the trial, not the hardship, not any of it. Because all of it, every difficult moment, every sacrifice, every struggle, all of it led us here, to this moment, to this life, to this love. And I would not trade this for anything. Not for all the money in England, not for all the social acceptance in the world. I have you, and you have me, and that is more than enough." Charles pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her in his arms. She was right, of course. She was always right. He had married her for her fortune, and in doing so had lost everything: his pride, his position, his place in the world he had been born to. But he had gained something infinitely more valuable. He had gained her, and in gaining her, he had gained himself, the man he was meant to be rather than the man society expected. "I love you," he said, the words simple and complete. "I know," Isabella replied, smiling against his chest. "And I love you, my impossible, stubborn, wonderful husband, my ruin and my salvation." They stood there in the music room as the sun set outside, two people who had found each other in the least romantic of circumstances and had built something beautiful from the rubble of scandal and loss. The estate still struggled sometimes, the social exile still stung occasionally, and the shadow of her father's crimes would never entirely disappear. But they had each other, and they had learned that was the only fortune that truly mattered. Years later, when their children asked about their love story, Isabella would smile and tell them the truth. Their father had married her for her money, and it had nearly destroyed them both. But in losing everything, they had found what really mattered. They had found each other, and that had made all the difference. Charles would always add his part, reminding their children that love was not about grand gestures or perfect beginnings. It was about choosing someone every day, through scandal and hardship and all the messy, complicated reality of life. It was about standing together when the world tried to tear you apart. It was about building something real from the ruins of what you thought you wanted. And their children, watching their parents still hold hands after all those years, still look at each other with eyes full of love despite everything they had endured, understood that they were witnessing something rare and precious, a love that had been forged in fire, tested by scandal, stripped of everything superficial, and had emerged stronger for it. The Duke and Duchess of Pembroke never returned to London society. They never regained the social position they had lost, never erased the taint of scandal from their names. But in the end, none of that mattered. They had found something more valuable than acceptance, more lasting than reputation, more precious than any fortune. They had found each other, truly found each other, and that was the greatest treasure of all. The estate survived, smaller than it had been, but stable and well managed. The children grew strong and healthy, raised with values of integrity and compassion rather than pride and pretension. And Charles and Isabella grew old together, partners in every sense, their love deepening with each passing year until it became impossible to remember a time when they had not been everything to each other. On his deathbed, many years later, Charles would hold Isabella's hand and whisper his final words: "I thought your fortune would save me, but it was your heart that gave me everything that mattered." And Isabella, her own eyes dimmed with age but still that clear, intelligent grey that had first surprised him so long ago, would smile and whisper back, "And I thought I was buying a title. Instead I found my home. Thank you, my love, for choosing me, for always choosing me." They had started as strangers bound by necessity, two people trapped in a transaction neither truly wanted, but they had become something far greater, two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed, not money or status or social position, but love, real and deep and absolutely worth the cost of everything they had lost to claim it. In the end, that was their story. Not a fairy tale of love at first sight or grand romance, but something better, something real. Two imperfect people who had found each other in the worst circumstances, had fought for each other when the world turned against them, and had built a life together that was richer than any fortune and more valuable than any title. A life built on love, hard-won and carefully tended, the kind of love that lasts not because it is easy, but because it is chosen every single day, no matter the cost. And that was the greatest fortune of all.